I have been crucified with Christ.
Amen.
It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. What did Paul mean when he wrote those words? I have been crucified with Christ. Now, it's one of those scriptures that we can take on a number of different levels. At one level, we can see it as Paul's own death to self. And certainly Paul, more than most people, recognised that the old life was dead. That everything that had been, or that he thought had been important to him, wasn't. And the very thing that he had despised, the very one whom he had despised, was the most important thing in the whole world. And that's a level that every one of us needs to come to. That point where we recognise that the old life is gone, that we are dead in Christ, as well as being alive in Christ. But you know, that is an outcome. And for there to be an outcome, there has to be something that went before it. And the thing that went before it was Jesus' total identification with us. Now, we all talk about the fact that Jesus paid the price of our sin. Remember back when I was a brand new Christian, we used to sing that old song, he paid a debt he did not owe. I owed a debt I could not pay. Anyone remember that one? Yeah. And it's so true. But sometimes we just think of that as, okay, here's Glenda Norton. She has robbed a bank. She's been fined $500,000. She can't pay $500,000. You can't pay $500,000. So Jesus comes along with his infinite supply of wealth and says, I'll pay it for you. But you know, it's really much deeper than that. Because Glenda hasn't just been fined $500,000. She's in jail. Was. And so another level of thinking of that is that Jesus came and said, I'll serve that jail sentence for you. But again, there's a deeper level to it. Because Jesus didn't just come and say, I'll serve that sentence for you. It was like he came into that jail cell and he said to the jailer, hey, you got the wrong person. That's not Glenda Norton. I'm Glenda Norton.
That's very good.
And he identified with our sin to the extent he actually took it into himself. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, so that we might become the righteousness of God. Yeah. And in Peter it says that he bore our sins in his own body on the tree. That's why in the garden, when the night before he was crucified, he was crying out to Father, Father, if it's at all possible, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. And the word tells us that he was in so much agony of spirit that he began to sweat drops of blood. And I don't believe for one moment that that was just because of the physical agony that he was going to endure the next day. As horrendous as that was. I mean, we know that crucifixion was the cruelest form of death that the Romans could come up with. If they could have come up with something crueler, they would have used it. But I believe that what drove Jesus to the point of sweating blood was not the physical pain that he was going to endure, but the fact that he recognised that he was about to have the whole weight of man's sin. For every person, from Adam right through to the last person who will be on earth, dumped upon him. And not just dumped upon him as something external, but dumped upon him as something that would permeate him. That he would carry it as if it was his own. That's why when he stood before the Sanhedrin, when he stood before Herod, when he stood before Pilate. He didn't speak in his defence. And you know, I used to get so upset with him. I used to say, Jesus, why? You were innocent. Why didn't you at least speak up and say, I'm not guilty? And then the Holy Spirit showed me. He couldn't. If he had said, I'm not guilty, then he would have been stepping out of that role as bearing our sins. Stepping out of that role as being us, being back to being himself. He was not guilty, but I was thoroughly guilty. You were thoroughly guilty. And he wasn't standing there as himself. He was standing there as us. And that's what he took to the cross. The fullness of our sin. You know, in those days, when somebody was in jail, they would write a notice of charge and put it on the outside of the cell. And that notice of charge would say three things. It would say the person's name, what they were charged with, and what their sentence was. So here's Glenda Norton. She's robbed a bank. She's sentenced to 50 years in jail. And in Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, it tells us that Jesus took that charge that was against us and cancelled it, nailing it to the cross.
Amen.
So what happened when Jesus was nailed to the cross? They put a charge sheet above him. What did it say? Jesus of Nazareth, his name, King of the Jews, what he was charged with. And they didn't need to put what his punishment was, because that was pretty obvious. But you know what? What Jesus did was turn that charge sheet into our charge sheet. He took our charge sheet and put it there. So it didn't just say Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. It said Lynn Fowler, and this is the charges against her. And you know, when I was preparing this message, I sort of went, Lord, if they're going to list the charges against me, it's going to be an awful long charge sheet. And then I thought, no, it's not. It's only going to have 4 words. High treason against God. That's what sin is. High treason against God. And what was the charge against Jesus? King of the Jews. High treason. Caesar was king. Herod was the sub-king. For another king to raise up was high treason. That's what he was charged with. Our charge was brought against him. But it gets even better. Because when somebody had finished their time in jail, they would take that charge sheet and they would write across it one word in Greek. And I can't say the word, but it meant it is finished. The debt is paid. So the charge sheet now became a discharge sheet that was handed to the person. And so Glenda's walking down the street and somebody sees her and says, hey, you robbed a bank, you should be in jail. Shouldn't I call the authorities? And she can pull out her discharge sheet and say, no, I've served my time. I've paid the price. The very last thing that Jesus said before he surrendered his spirit back to the Father was, it is finished. And it was the same word. The same word that was written across that charge sheet to turn it into a discharge sheet. Jesus wrote across our charge sheet and turned it into our discharge sheet.
Thank you, Lord.
It is finished.
Thank you, Father.
I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. I want to do something a little different now. Just as we prepare to take the communion, I want you to close your eyes. I'm going to read you a poem. It's one I wrote some years ago when God was making all this stuff very real and personal to me. And it's written in the first person. I want you to make it your first person as you meditate for just these few moments on what God has done. It's called substitute. It should have been I in the judgment hall, facing the charges brought, indicted justly for my wrongs before a righteous judge. Yet you stood instead, the sinless God hauled for judgment before sinful man. You spoke not to defend your innocence, but in silence bore my guilt, and in my place received the sentence due to me. It should have been I whose back was whipped, for beatings are for the backs of fools, and I in foolishness have set before you other gods, of stone, of flesh, of thought, but mostly of myself, whilst you, wisdom personified, have brought the truth. It should have been I whose hands and feet were nailed to cruel beams, wrenched as they shuddered into place, and torn by the weight of sin's burden. For my hands have often been the instrument of evil, and yet more often still have failed to do the good they could have wrought. My feet have carried me to places where your spirit could not comfortably rest, but your hands brought only life, and your feet led you only in the Father's paths. It should have been I whose head was crowned with cruel thorns. For thoughts of anger, hatred, envy, lust and greed are not strangers to its paths, and my mind in rebellion has often sought to raise itself about the throne of God. But your mind bowed before the Father's will, obedient even to this ignominious end. It should have been I whose heart was pierced, this heart in which the depths of degradation lurk, whose motives all are tainted with corruption, and whose purest thoughts stink of death. Instead, your heart of love was rent, not by the soldier's sword, but by my guilt. It should have been I who died, exposed in naked shame before the eyes of all who cared to look, screaming eternally to unresponding infinity for the just God who turned his head away. But you, the righteous one, received my wages due, and I, walking free and clean, offer my inadequate response. Thank you. Thank you. The night he was betrayed, Jesus took bread and blessed it and broke it. He gave it to his disciples and said, "Take and eat. This is my body, broken for you." Let's eat together. Yeah. After the supper, he took a cup. He blessed it and gave it to his disciples and said, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. As often as you do it, remember me."